Before we get into today's case, I want to thank Star Chef 2 for sponsoring this video. Star Chef 2 is a cooking and restaurant management game where players cook, bake and grill the finest cuisines using state-of-the-art appliances. Players can hire chefs with exceptional cooking skills and cater to the needs of customers who are craving for fine dine delicacies from across the globe. I recently started playing with friends and I really enjoy the mini-games and competing in tournaments. One of my favourite things to do is going trick-or-treating in the haunted graveyard with quirky in-game characters in search of secret ingredients and spooky mysteries. Also, I find that Star Chef 2 is a great way to relax after a long day, and it's so satisfying to see my cooking skills improve and to progress in the game. I also love that Star Chef 2 has an amazing community of players, and players can even team up to collaborate in events and compete with other teams to ultimately secure the coveted title of Star Chef. Make sure you check out Star Chef 2 by clicking the links below to join in the fun and start playing today. Maybe you'll even run into me while playing. Today we are looking at a case from the early 20th century, so sit back as we go to the USA. Arthur Warren Waite was born on the 2nd of December 1886 in Canonsburg, Kent County, Michigan. He was the youngest child of Warren and Sarah Waite and had 2 brothers and 1 sister. Arthur's parents kept a small farm and also worked on their own vegetable stall. The family did not have very much money, but they worked hard to earn what they could to get by. When Arthur was in primary school, he managed to get a job delivering newspapers. He did well at school and succeeded in sports, especially tennis, where he won a number of local tournaments. After graduating in 1905, he studied to become a dentist and attended the University of Michigan. Here he was a popular student, especially with the young ladies. He had a charming manner and was considered to be very handsome. Arthur, however, was not very truthful while studying in Michigan. He was often caught lying, stealing, and copying work. He was eventually asked to leave the university, but that did not deter him. He doctored records that made it seem like he had completed things that he didn't actually complete, and somehow he managed to secure himself a scholarship to study in Scotland. The course he was enrolled to study was meant to take 2 years, but strangely, Arthur was able to complete it much quicker. He was then given a bonus and received an offer to work as a dentist with a mining company in South Africa. The employment lasted for 2 years, but was eventually terminated after a manager suspected him of stealing when it was discovered that a large amount of money had gone missing. Strangely, the manager died soon after, officially of apoplexy. Arthur then promptly returned to the United States. It was reported that during his time working in the mining company, he had embezzled approximately $7,000. Before Arthur had left for Scotland, he had become acquainted with a lady named Clara Peck. They got along well and continued to correspond during the time that Arthur was overseas. Clara was born on the 9th of December 1887 and was the youngest of 3 children. Sadly, her elder sister died when Clara was just 8 years old. Unlike Arthur, however, growing up, Clara was no stranger to money. Her grandfather had started a family drugstore, and when her father finished his education, he and his brother founded a drug company that they named Peck Brothers. They eventually sold this for a very large sum. Clara's father also worked as the president of the National City Bank and held shares in many companies. By 1915, it was believed he was worth in excess of $1 million. Clara had enjoyed a very privileged education and attended a prestigious private all-girls school in Washington. Now back in the USA, Arthur settled in New York. He told everyone that he had set up a dental practice and had begun to study medicine. The same year, Clara's mother was throwing a social gathering, and Clara invited Arthur to attend. She was very impressed by his achievements and liked to spend time in his company. Clara and Arthur then started courting. Clara had an elder brother called Percy, and he was not so keen on Arthur and did not think that his sister should be with him. However, Mrs. Hannah Peck, Clara's mother, liked him very much, so much so, she encouraged her daughter to marry him. Arthur and Clara continued to go out, and eventually Arthur proposed to her, and of course, she accepted. As a wedding gift, Clara's father, Mr. John Peck, gave them $50,000, a very large sum of money at the time. But the gift was not $50,000 all at once. Instead, the money was to be held in trust, and the couple would only be able to withdraw $300 a month. Just a few weeks before Arthur and Clara's wedding, it was alleged that he proposed to another woman. The woman, knowing that Arthur was already spoken for, sent a letter to Clara, telling her about his proposal and advising her not to marry him. Clara took no notice and married him anyway. The wedding took place at the Fountain Street Baptist Church on the 19th of September 1915. Following this, they moved into a luxurious 7-bedroom apartment on Riverside Drive in Manhattan that Mr. John Peck had purchased for them. While apparently studying medicine at the Cornell Medical School, Arthur would tell people that he was employed in different New York hospitals, and it seemed as though he worked very long hours. When he wasn't working, he would play tennis and impress New York society with his skills on the courts. He was certainly becoming quite well known in the most exclusive New York social circles, and he tried to impress everyone he spoke to. Clara's wealthy Aunt Catherine was so taken by him that she gave him $40,000 and asked him to invest it for her. Just after their first Christmas together, Clara and Arthur invited Clara's mother, Mrs. Hannah Peck, to stay with them in their New York apartment. The apartment was in a very picturesque part of Manhattan, on Riverside Drive, a long tree-lined road with large houses and new apartment buildings that overlooked the Hudson River. The area had been attracting wealthy New York residents since 1904, following the opening of the subway that meant it became possible to commute from the Upper West Side of Manhattan to the business areas of the city. Mrs. Peck arrived on the 10th of January 1916, but strangely, soon started to feel unwell. Although during her visits, Arthur had been very busy, leaving the apartment very early and not returning until late in the evening. When his mother-in-law became ill, he suddenly became very attentive and did his best to look after her. He brought her roses and sat by her bed. However, she did not seem to be getting any better. Instead, her condition was becoming worse. Then on the 30th of January, the previously healthy Mrs. Hannah Peck passed away. Doctors diagnosed the cause of death as kidney disease. Her body was transported to her home in Grand Rapids, and although it was always thought that she would be buried, Arthur said that she had asked to be cremated in order to limit everyone's grief. Mrs. Hannah Peck was 64 years old when she died. Shortly after the death of his wife, Mr. John Peck, now a widower, went to New York to stay with his daughter. He was in very good health when he arrived, but just a little while later, he began to feel unwell. Arthur gave him a throat spray to help with his condition, telling him to use it several times a day. Apparently the illness had begun just a few hours after he had eaten some ice cream, and it gradually got worse. The symptoms he experienced included stomach pain, nausea, and vomiting. Clara and Arthur's maid said that she thought that she had seen Arthur adding something to the broth he prepared for his father-in-law, but when questioned about this, Arthur said that Mr. Peck was a difficult patient and he wouldn't take his medication, so he had to mix it with his food. Clara was becoming increasingly more worried about her father, so contacted a doctor. The doctor visited the apartment daily, but Mr. Peck's condition did not improve. He complained that he was suffering from nausea and said that he was finding it difficult to eat. Clara's father, Mr. John Peck, died on the 12th of March 1916, and his cause of death was reported as heart disease and nephritis. Arthur said that it was John's wish to be cremated in Grand Rapids like his wife. He then arranged to travel there by train along with the body. It was an extremely sad time for Clara, who had now lost both her mother and her father. When she and Arthur arrived at the Grand Rapids station, they were met by Clara's brother Percy. He had never really liked his sister's husband and had become quite suspicious of him. His suspicions had increased as shortly before Arthur and Clara arrived, he had received a telegram from someone named Miss Kay Adams, stating that he should demand an autopsy on his father's body, as Miss Adams believed that Mr. John Peck's death may have been due to something other than illness and old age. Although Percy did not know who Kay Adams was, he took the telegram very seriously. He questioned Arthur as to how both his parents had died while in New York under his care, and in such a short space of time. Arthur did not really have any answers, except that neither had been in very good health. Percy took his father's body into his possession and arranged for a private autopsy to be performed. That evening, Arthur went to the mortuary. He claimed that he had a flower and a picture of Clara that he wanted to put into Mr. Peck's caskets. However, his request was refused, which resulted in Arthur becoming quite distressed. He said that neither he or his wife Clara had requested an autopsy, and that there had been no permission given to conduct one. Clara's brother, however, had not only arranged it, he had become so concerned that he hired someone to guard his father's body right up to the funeral. The autopsy examined Mr. Peck's heart and lungs, and the results did not suggest that his demise had been due to heart or kidney disease, which had been given as the original cause of death. Chloroform was also found in his brain. His stomach was then sent to Dr. Victor C. Vaughan at the medical department at the University of Michigan, who would conduct further examinations. The funeral of Mr. John Peck was held 2 days later and was attended by neither Arthur or Clara. Their reasoning was that Clara was too emotional and that Arthur stayed with his wife to look after her. However, the pair did manage to be in attendance for the reading of the will. Here the attorney informed everyone present that the majority of Mr. Peck's estates would be split equally between his children Clara and Percy. Clara's brother, Mr. Percy Peck, was now becoming increasingly more convinced that his brother-in-law had had something to do with the deaths of his parents and was now becoming concerned for the safety of his sister. He enlisted the help of a private investigator, a gentleman named Mr. Raymond Schindler. Mr. Schindler looked into Arthur's business and his supposed dentistry credentials. Strangely, he was unable to find very much at all about Dr. Arthur Waite. He could not locate his dental surgery. In fact, there wasn't even a New York dentistry license registered in his name. What the investigator did discover, though, was that Arthur knew a lot of people and was considered a social butterfly and an admirer of showgirls. Raymond managed to get the supervisor of Arthur and Clara's apartment block to let him and his team into the apartments to investigate further. While searching the apartments, they found some very interesting items. In a safe was a large amount of cash, possibly the money that Clara's Aunt Catherine had asked Arthur to invest for her. Arsenic was bookmarked in a pharmacology book, and there were glass slides of typhoid specimens in his office. They found out that he had been conducting private studies at Cornwall Medical School, even though he wasn't formally enrolled. He had told the professors that he had wished to study this in order that one day he may be able to prevent people dying from the diseases caused by these bacteria. Investigators also discovered that he had a room at the Plaza Hotel, which had been registered under the name Dr. and Mrs. Margaret Walters. Mrs. Margaret Walters was really a married lady named Margaret Hornton, who worked as a cabaret singer. Although they had taken a suite at the hotel, Mrs. Hornton would later insist that their relationship was purely platonic. With all the evidence pointing at Arthur having something to do with the deaths of his in-laws, the police took him in for questioning. They asked him if he had purchased arsenic, which Arthur denied, and he said that he would never hurt anyone. The police reminded him of a conversation that he had had with Clara's Aunt Catherine just a week after Mr. John Peck's death. Apparently he had called her and asked, "What do you think a man should do if he was cornered? Would you consider suicide?" Arthur denied all the accusations the police put to him, and following the questioning, he was released and returned to his Riverside Drive apartment. At about the same time, the results of the autopsy on Mr. John Peck's stomach were released and confirmed that he had been poisoned. Now, with all the evidence from the autopsy, the police went to arrest Mr. Arthur Waite. However, when they arrived at his apartment, they discovered that he was in a very bad way. He was in a coma as a result of taking an overdose of sleeping tablets. He was taken to hospital, where doctors pumped his stomach and managed to return him to consciousness. Upon his recovery, he was immediately arrested. Arthur denied that he had poisoned his father-in-law, but the police were continuing to gather evidence. They discovered that he had purchased arsenic from a local doctor. They also uncovered that Arthur had paid the undertaker who had embalmed Mr. Peck to do so using fluid containing arsenic. This method had been used in the 19th century, but was now prohibited. Arthur had paid quite a lot of money for him to do this, and although the undertaker was happy to accept the payments, he did not actually put any arsenic in the embalming fluid. The police considered that they had enough evidence and charged Arthur Warren Waite with the murder of his father-in-law, Mr. John Peck. The trial began in April 1916, and Arthur pleaded not guilty even though he had written to a New York newspaper confessing to the crimes. It was also revealed that the mysterious Miss Kay Adams, who had sent the telegram to Percy following the death of his father, was actually Mrs. Elizabeth Hardwick, the sister of Dr. Cornell, who was in charge of the Cornell Medical School, where Arthur seemed to spend so much time. She had become very suspicious of him following the deaths of Mr. and Mrs. Peck, and wondered why he had such a fascination for lethal bacterias. Mrs. Margaret Horton told the court that Arthur had actually taken her to the Cornell laboratory and showed her different deadly bacterias. By this time, Mr. and Mrs. Peck had both died, and when Mrs. Horton asked him if he had been responsible for their deaths, he replied that indeed he was. Arthur took to the stand in his own defence and told a strange tale of how the spirit of an evil Egyptian priest had entered his body and then instructed him to kill his in-laws in order to gain their wealth. It was believed he did this in the hope that the jury would find him insane. However, he had been examined by psychiatrists before the trial, and they all agreed that he was in fact sane. The jury did not fall for his tall tale, and in May 1916, Mr. Arthur Warren Waite was found guilty of the murder of Mr. John Peck and sentenced to death by the electric chair. While awaiting his execution at Sing Sing prison, Arthur omitted the methods he used to successfully poison his mother-in-law, Mrs. Hannah Peck, and his father-in-law, Mr. John Peck. He said that Mrs. Peck had died relatively quickly. He had started to mix things in her food on the day she arrived. The assortment of germs he used included diphtheria and influenza. On the evening of the 29th of January 1916, he gave her Veronal tablets, and when he checked on her again in the early hours of the following day, he realised that she was dead. He said that he returned to bed as he thought it best that Clara discover that her mother had passed away during the night. It had been, however, far more difficult to kill his father-in-law. He tried diphtheria, tuberculosis, typhus and influenza, but this did not have the desired effect, so in the end he smothered him with a rag covered in chloroform. Arthur Warren Waite was executed in the electric chair on the 24th of May 1917. After Arthur's death, an autopsy was performed. During this, two very interesting facts were discovered. One was a scar, which was caused as he had suffered from meningitis as a child, and doctors believed that this may have partially accounted for his psychopathic disposition. The other was something that would not normally be associated with a murderer, which was a very large heart. Arthur's wife Clara married again and had a daughter who she named Louise. Clara died in Seattle in 1964, aged 76. Thanks everyone for watching this video, and make sure to download Star Chef 2 and start playing today. Please leave any comments, and I hope to see you all again in the next Brief Case